The morning sun peeked through the kitchen windows as Mom checked her handwritten to-do list for the 100th time. The house buzzed with energy as the family prepared for their biggest celebration yet. Their eldest son, a respected army sergeant, was finally coming home after 15 long months in Afghanistan. This wasn't just any homecoming, it was his third tour of duty, and this time he was here to stay. Did anyone pick up the extra chairs from Uncle Ray? Mom called out while stirring a pot of her famous sweet potato stew, a recipe passed down through 4 generations. The aroma filled their modest suburban home, mixing with the scent of freshly baked cornbread and honey butter. Got them in the garage already? Her younger son shouted from the backyard, where he was setting up tables borrowed from their church. At 16, he had stepped up as the man of the house during his brother's deployment, and today he wanted everything to be perfect. Dad, who usually kept his emotions in check, couldn't stop grinning as he hung up the welcome home banner across the front porch. His hands trembled slightly as he secured each corner, thinking about hugging his boy again. 6 months ago, when they'd moved into this predominantly white neighborhood, some folks had given them the cold shoulder. But today wasn't about them, it was about celebrating their son's safe return. The kitchen counter disappeared under a growing collection of soul food favorites. Mom's sisters had arrived early, bringing their specialties: fresh macaroni and cheese, collard greens seasoned just right, and 3 different kinds of homemade pies. The women chatted as they worked, their laughter carrying through the house like music. "Remember when he was 5? One aunt said, chopping celery for the potato salad. That boy would put on his daddy's old work boots and march around the house like he was already in the service. The women chuckled, but Mom had to wipe away a tear, remembering her baby boy who'd grown into a decorated soldier. Outside, Dad and his brother-in-law fired up 2 grills. They had enough food planned to feed an army, which was fitting, since their soldier was bringing some of his combat buddies along. The smell of charcoal and hickory chips drifted through the neighborhood as they debated the perfect temperature for barbecuing ribs. Little kids, cousins from both sides of the family, ran through the sprinkler in the backyard, their squeals of delight filling the air. They'd made welcome home cards with crayon drawings of American flags and soldiers, now proudly displayed on the refrigerator. Mom paused her cooking to look out the kitchen window. She noticed a couple of neighbors peering from behind their curtains at the growing activity, their faces pinched with what looked like concern. She sighed softly but squared her shoulders. Nothing was going to spoil this day, not the summer heat, not the disapproving looks, not even her own worries about her son's readjustment to civilian life. The doorbell rang, and Mom's heart jumped before she remembered it was just the early guests. More family members poured in, arms laden with covered dishes and decorations. Each person who entered brought another wave of joy and anticipation. They had moved away from their old neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, but today it felt like home again. Dad's phone buzzed. A text from their son. "On my way from the airport. Can't wait to see everyone." Mom read the message over Dad's shoulder, and they shared a moment of pure happiness. Their boy was almost home. As the morning stretched into early afternoon, cars lined the street, and the house filled with the warmth of family, friends, and love. Some people from their church had come early to help set up, bringing extra tables and chairs. The garage was transformed into a buffet station, with Uncle Ray's famous punch bowl taking center stage. Through it all, Mom kept busy in the kitchen, channeling her nervous energy into cooking. But every few minutes, she'd glance at the clock, counting down the hours until she could wrap her arms around her firstborn again. This wasn't just a party, it was a testament to their family's strength, their love, and their pride in a son who had served his country with honor. The house might have been in a new neighborhood where they didn't quite fit in yet, but today it was filled with the familiar sounds, smells, and faces that made it home. As Mom put the finishing touches on her sweet potato stew, she smiled, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together, as they always had. The afternoon sun beat down on the quiet suburban street as cars began filling the empty spots one by one. From behind her living room curtains, the woman at number 42 watched with growing unease as more vehicles arrived. She'd moved to this neighborhood 20 years ago for its peace and quiet, and she intended to keep it that way. "Harold," she called to her husband, who was trying to enjoy his crossword puzzle. "That's the 4th car in 10 minutes. They're taking up all the street parking. She drummed her perfectly manicured nails against the window frame, counting each new arrival like a military strategist tracking enemy movements. Next door, another neighbor stepped out to collect his mail, deliberately taking longer than necessary as he observed the growing gathering. The sound of laughter and children's voices carried across well-manicured lawns. He pulled out his phone, quickly typing a message to the Neighborhood Watch group chat. Major activity at the new family's house. Inside their homes, phones began buzzing. The Neighborhood Watch chat filled with messages. Anyone know what's going on? Must be at least 15 cars already. Has anyone called about noise regulations? They just moved in, they should know better. The woman at number 42 paced her living room, phone pressed to her ear. Yes, Carol, I'm telling you it's getting out of hand, she whispered, as if the partygoers might hear her through the walls. They've got 2 grills going. 2. The smoke is probably going to set off someone's allergies. Her husband peered over his reading glasses. Maybe it's just a family reunion, he suggested mildly, but his wife was already dialing another number. Outside, more guests arrived, their cars now stretching around the corner. Each carried something: covered dishes, gift bags, balloons in red, white, and blue. Children played tag between the vehicles, their joy-filled shrieks cutting through the usual suburban quiet. The HOA president's phone wouldn't stop ringing. She sat at her kitchen table, fielding calls from increasingly agitated neighbors. Yes, I understand your concerns, she repeated for the 5th time. No, they didn't file a party permit, but technically they don't need one for a family gathering. Back at number 42, the woman's anxiety peaked as she spotted a group of young men arriving together, their cars parking near her prized rose bushes. Did you see that? She hissed to her husband. There must be 20 people out there now. What if they damage our property values? The Neighborhood Watch chat continued to blow up with messages. Someone had Googled the noise ordinance laws. Another suggested calling the non-emergency police line, just to be safe. A third complained about the music, though it was barely audible from inside their homes. Across the street, an elderly resident who'd lived there since the neighborhood was built watched the unfolding drama with a different perspective. Through her window, she saw families greeting each other with hugs, children playing safely away from the main road, and adults carefully directing parking to ensure fire hydrants and driveways remained clear. But her voice of reason was drowned out in the chat by louder, more insistent messages. The woman at number 42 had now positioned herself by her front window, phone in hand like a weapon. She documented each new arrival, each burst of laughter, each child who stepped onto her immaculate lawn. Her husband had given up on his crossword puzzle, knowing from 25 years of marriage that peace and quiet were no longer possible with his wife in such a state. The afternoon wore on, and the gathering showed no signs of slowing down. If anything, it seemed to be growing more festive. The scent of barbecue drifted through the neighborhood, making stomachs growl despite the residents' determination to remain annoyed. Finally, the woman at number 42 made the call she'd been threatening for the past hour. Yes, I'd like to report a disturbance, she said into her phone, voice trembling with what she convinced herself was civic duty rather than prejudice. There's an unauthorized large gathering, and we're concerned about safety and noise. As she hung up, satisfied that order would soon be restored, she failed to notice the military bumper stickers on several of the parked cars. She missed the American flag carefully folded into a triangle, carried reverently by one of the arriving guests, and she certainly didn't see the tears of joy in the eyes of family members as they gathered to welcome home one of their own. The Neighborhood Watch chat pinged with triumphant messages as 2 police cruisers turned onto their street. The woman at number 42 smiled, certain she had protected her community's standards. But she had no idea that her actions were about to backfire in ways she never expected, or that her definition of community standards was about to be thoroughly challenged. The atmosphere shifted the moment the guest of honor's car turned onto the street. Mom spotted it first. The familiar blue sedan driven by Uncle Ray, with her son in his crisp dress uniform sitting tall in the passenger seat. Her heart skipped a beat as she called out, "He's here." The words rippled through the gathering like electricity. Children stopped their games, adults paused their conversations, and everyone moved toward the front yard. The afternoon sun caught the medals on the soldier's chest as he stepped out of the car, his combat boots touching home soil with purpose. Time seemed to slow down as Mom and Dad moved forward. 3 tours, countless sleepless nights, hundreds of prayers, all leading to this moment. Their son's face broke into that same bright smile they'd missed for 15 months, the one that could light up any room since he was a little boy. "Welcome home, baby," Mom whispered as she wrapped her arms around him. She felt his strong arms embrace her, and for a moment she was holding both her grown warrior and her little boy, who used to chase fireflies in their old backyard. Dad joined the hug, his usual stoic demeanor cracking as tears rolled freely down his cheeks. Behind them, someone started clapping, and suddenly the whole gathering erupted in cheers and applause. The soldier's younger brother bounded down the porch steps, nearly tackling him with a hug that would have knocked over anyone who hadn't been through military training. More cars pulled up, his unit members arriving right on time. They stepped out in their dress uniforms, medals glinting in the sunlight. These were the men and women who'd become his second family, who'd shared meals from tin cans and watched each other's backs in the darkest hours. "Sarge," they called out, using his rank with a mixture of respect and affection. Each hug came with a story only they knew. Each handshake carried the weight of shared experiences civilians could never fully understand. They represented every corner of America, different backgrounds, different beliefs, all united by service and brotherhood. The party shifted into full swing. The smell of barbecue filled the air as Dad and his brothers manned the grills, arguing good-naturedly about the perfect way to flip a burger. Kids resumed their games, now with the soldiers' combat buddies joining in, teaching them modified versions of military training exercises that had the children squealing with delight. In the garage-turned-buffet station, Mom's sweet potato stew sat alongside dishes that told the story of their heritage. Aunt Ruby's cornbread, Cousin Big Mike's secret recipe wings, and Mom's own pearl sugar cookies, the ones she'd sent overseas in every care package. The food table became a museum of family history and love, each dish carrying memories of past gatherings and celebrations. The soldier moved through the crowd, making sure to thank everyone who'd come. He stopped to admire the children's crayon drawings, got pulled into endless selfies with his younger cousins, and shared long hugs with the aunties who'd helped raise him. His laugh, so long absent from family gatherings, rang out often and true. Music played at a respectful volume, a carefully curated playlist that moved from soul classics to modern hits. The older folks claimed chairs in the shade, fanning themselves as they watched the younger generation show off dance moves. Even Dad got pulled into an impromptu dance with Mom, recreating their wedding shuffle to the delight of watching family. The soldiers' unit members shared stories with the family, carefully edited versions that highlighted their sergeant's leadership while skating around the scarier moments. They spoke of his quick thinking during training exercises, his habit of sharing Mom's cookies with everyone, and how he kept their spirits up during long deployments with his terrible jokes. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the yard, someone suggested taking a group photo. The family arranged themselves on and around the porch, with the soldier in the center. Just before Uncle Ray could snap the picture, Mom noticed her son's posture change, that subtle shift to attention that 3 tours had ingrained in him. Looking down the street, she saw what had caught his eye: 2 police cruisers rolling slowly toward their celebration. The music wasn't too loud, the cars were legally parked, and the gathering was well within their rights. But she knew with a mother's instinct that someone had decided their joy was somehow wrong for their neighborhood. The soldier squeezed her hand gently, a gesture that said more than words could. In that touch was every lesson she'd taught him about facing adversity with dignity, about standing tall when others tried to make you feel small. He'd carried those lessons through war zones. They would carry the family through what was coming next. The 2 police cruisers pulled up slowly, their presence casting an immediate shadow over the celebration. The woman from number 42 emerged from her house with an air of satisfaction, followed by several other neighbors who had been watching from behind their curtains all afternoon. The music faded as Dad walked calmly to meet the officers, his shoulders straight but his heart heavy with a burden too familiar. Behind him, Mom quietly asked the children to move toward the backyard, where Uncle Ray and the aunties gathered them into a protective circle. "Afternoon, officers," Dad said, his voice steady and dignified. The first officer, a younger man with kind eyes, stepped out of his cruiser and surveyed the scene. His partner, an older officer with salt and pepper hair, was already taking notes. "We received multiple noise complaints," the younger officer began, but his voice trailed off as he noticed the military uniforms scattered throughout the crowd. His eyes lingered on the American flag displayed proudly on the porch, then moved to the Welcome Home banner swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. The woman from number 42 strode forward, clipboard in hand like a weapon. "They haven't filed any permits for this gathering," she announced loudly. "There must be at least 50 people here, and the cars are everywhere." Several other neighbors nodded in agreement, emboldened by her confrontational tone. The soldier stepped forward then, his dress uniform immaculate, medals catching the sunlight. His combat buddies moved closer, not in a threatening way, but with the quiet solidarity forged in far more dangerous situations than this. "Ma'am," the older officer said, turning to the neighbor, "I'm not seeing any violations here. The music is at an acceptable level, and all vehicles are legally parked." He paused, looking at the soldier's medals with growing recognition. "Those are some impressive decorations, son." The younger officer, who had been walking the perimeter, returned to add, "All the fire lanes are clear, and they're well within the noise ordinance limits." His hand unconsciously moved to touch the veteran's pin on his own collar. But the woman from number 42 wasn't finished. "This isn't about parking or noise," she said, her voice sharp. "This neighborhood has standards, and they need to understand." "Standards?" A new voice cut through the tension. Everyone turned to see an older man walking with a cane making his way down from the house next door. He wore a Korean War veteran's cap, and his eyes blazed with quiet fury. "I've lived here for 40 years, the veteran neighbor continued, "and I'd say these standards you're talking about could use some improvement." He moved to stand beside the soldier's family. "This young man served 3 tours protecting your right to make complaints about nothing." The soldier's commanding officer, who had arrived just moments before the police, stepped forward. He was a tall man with graying temples and a presence that commanded attention. "I flew in from Fort Bragg to be here today," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet gathering. "This sergeant saved 6 lives during an ambush last year. 6 families still have their loved ones because of his courage." The woman from number 42 shifted uncomfortably, her clipboard lowering slightly. Other complaining neighbors began to step back, their certainty wavering as they looked at the collection of uniforms, medals, and the obvious respect the police officers were showing to the soldier. One of the soldier's unit members, still wearing his dress uniform, spoke up. "We've shared foxholes, MREs, and letters from home. We're family. All of us." He gestured to the diverse group of service members present, "and family celebrates together." The older police officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, not only is this gathering completely legal, but it's also exactly what we should be encouraging in our communities." He turned to the soldier and saluted. "Welcome home, Sergeant. Thank you for your service." The younger officer added, "We'll be on our way. Enjoy your celebration, folks." As they turned to leave, he paused and looked back at the complaining neighbors. "I'd suggest getting to know your neighbors better. You might be surprised by what you learn." The woman from number 42 stood frozen, her clipboard now hanging limply at her side. The truth of what she'd done, trying to shut down a hero's homecoming, seemed to finally sink in. Her face flushed red as she looked around at the gathering, seeing it properly for the first time. Families celebrating their loved one's safe return, children playing peacefully, fellow service members honoring their brother-in-arms. As the police cruisers pulled away, the music slowly resumed. The soldier's mom stepped forward and, in an act of grace that left many observers speechless, turned to the woman from number 42. "Would you like to join us? There's plenty of food, and I make a sweet potato stew that might just change your life." The tension broke like a fever, and the celebration gradually returned to its former joy. Some of the neighbors who had come to complain found themselves drawn into conversations with the guests, their preconceptions challenged by each personal story they heard. The mood shifted as the soldier's commanding officer stepped into the center of the gathering. He was a man whose presence commanded attention without asking for it, his silver hair and battle-worn face telling stories before he even spoke. The neighbors who had been complaining just moments ago fell silent, sensing something important was about to happen. I flew 2,000 miles to be here today, the commander began, his voice carrying across the yard. Because this isn't just any homecoming. He turned to face the woman from number 42, who was still clutching her clipboard like a shield. Ma'am, do you know what that medal on his chest means? She shook her head slightly, her earlier confidence crumbling as she noticed everyone's eyes on her. The soldier stood tall but humble, his mother's hand still firmly gripped in his. That silver star? He earned it 3 months ago. The commander's voice softened with pride and memory. We were pinned down in a valley. Bad situation. Enemy fire coming from 3 directions. He paused, letting the reality of war sink into this peaceful suburban street. Your neighbor's son here, he didn't just save my life. He saved our entire unit. The elderly veteran neighbor who had spoken up earlier nodded knowingly, his own memories of combat visible in his eyes. Some of the other neighbors began to shift uncomfortably, their earlier complaints about parking and noise suddenly seeming terribly small. One of the soldiers' unit members, a young man with a slight limp, stepped forward. I can walk today because of him, he said simply. He carried me half a mile under fire after I got hit. Never even told anyone his own arm was bleeding. The soldier's mom wiped tears from her eyes as she heard these stories for the first time. Her son had always been modest in his letters home, downplaying the danger, focusing instead on asking about family recipes and neighborhood news. A young woman in uniform, who had arrived with the unit, spoke next. We were out there for 18 hours straight that day, no backup coming, low on ammo. She looked at the complaining neighbors with steady eyes. Your neighbor's son kept us calm, kept us focused, kept us alive. He led us out of that valley one by one. The commander reached into his jacket and pulled out an official-looking document. This citation just came through. Another commendation for extraordinary leadership under fire. He cleared his throat, emotion making his voice rough. 27 soldiers went home to their families because of the decisions he made that day. The woman from number 42 had lost her grip on her clipboard entirely now. It hung forgotten at her side as she stared at the young man in uniform, the same young man she'd been trying to have removed from his own homecoming party just minutes ago. One of the soldier's cousins, a teenager who had been filming the whole thing on his phone, spoke up. Already got 10,000 views, he said, holding up his phone. People are loving this story. The comments are wild. The local news van that had just pulled up caught everyone's attention. A reporter stepped out, drawn by the social media buzz already building around the incident. The complaining neighbors began to back away, but the soldier's father raised his hand. Wait, he said, his voice gentle but firm. Stay. Please, this isn't about shame or blame. It's about understanding. The soldier himself finally spoke, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had seen both the worst and best of humanity. When you're out there, he said, looking at each of his former critics, you learn real quick that differences don't matter. The color of your skin, where you come from, what you believe, none of that matters when you're trying to keep each other alive. His words hung in the air, heavy with truth. The reporter had her microphone out, but seemed to sense this wasn't the moment to interrupt. We protected each other, the soldier continued. We protected you, all of you. Your right to live where you want, to complain about your neighbors, to call the police on a family party. He smiled slightly. Even your right to be wrong about people you don't know. The woman from number 42 stepped forward then, her face flushed with shame and something else, perhaps the first stirrings of understanding. I didn't know, she stammered. We didn't know. No, you didn't, the soldier's mother said softly. But now you do. So let's start again. She gestured to the food tables. The potato stew is still hot, and there's plenty for everyone. The news reporter was scribbling frantically, capturing what was becoming not just a story about prejudice, but about redemption, about the possibility of change, about the power of seeing beyond our prejudgments to the humanity we share. The commanding officer looked around at the gathered crowd, the chastened neighbors, the proud family, the loyal unit members, the curious onlookers. This, he said, this right here. This is what we fight for. Not just freedom, but the chance to understand each other better. To do better. Word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By sunset, phones were buzzing with social media notifications, and the local news segment had already aired on the evening broadcast. The story of the war hero's homecoming and the neighbors who tried to shut it down had touched a nerve in the community. The next morning brought a steady stream of visitors to the family's front door. The first was the elderly couple from 3 houses down, carrying a homemade apple pie and red-faced with embarrassment. "We watched the news last night," the wife said softly. "We had no idea. We just wanted to say welcome to the neighborhood. For real this time." The soldier's mother accepted the pie with grace, inviting them in for coffee. As they sat in the kitchen, the elderly man pulled out old photos of his own military service. "Korea," he said simply, showing them to the soldier. "Different war, same courage." By mid-morning, the local veterans group had gotten wind of the story. A line of motorcycles roared down the street, American flags waving proudly from their bikes. They parked carefully, respecting the neighbors' driveways, and approached the house with purpose. Their leader, a Vietnam vet with a silver beard, presented the soldier with a leather jacket bearing their group's insignia. "Your family now," he said gruffly, emotion thick in his voice. "Anytime, any place you need something, we're there." The woman from number 42 watched from her window as more people arrived throughout the day. She saw that HOA president walking up with an official letter in hand, a formal apology from the board, and a welcome packet that should have been delivered months ago. Her own daughter, home from college, had tears in her eyes after watching the viral video of yesterday's confrontation. "Mom," her daughter said quietly, "you need to make this right." Around lunchtime, the local newspaper reporter showed up, not for another story, but bringing his teenage son who was considering joining the military. "Would you mind talking to him?" he asked the soldier. "He has questions only someone like you can answer." The soldier spent an hour with the boy on the front porch, sharing honest truths about service, sacrifice, and the real meaning of protecting home. Neighbors passing by could hear fragments of their conversation, see the boy's eager face and the soldier's patient explanations. Social media had transformed the story into something bigger than one neighborhood's prejudice. People shared their own stories of discrimination, of military service, of communities learning to bridge their divides. The family's address was flooded with cards and letters from across the country. A group of local teachers asked if the soldier would speak at their school about his experiences. Not just about the war, they explained, but about coming home, about facing prejudice, about bringing people together. The woman from number 42 finally worked up the courage to cross the street again. This time she carried no clipboard, no complaints. Instead, she brought a photo album. "This was my father," she said, showing them a picture of a young man in uniform. "He fought in Vietnam. Came home to people spitting on him." Her voice cracked. "I forgot his lessons about judgment and honor. I forgot what it means to be a real American." The local church groups and community organizations began reaching out. They wanted to organize a proper welcome home ceremony, something to show that this neighborhood could be better than its worst moments. The soldier's mother found herself on planning committees with the very people who had tried to shut down their celebration. As evening approached, kids played basketball in the driveway. The soldier's younger cousins now mixed with neighborhood children who had never spoken to them before. The sound of their laughter and friendly trash talk filled the street where tension had reigned just yesterday. The elderly veteran neighbor sat in his usual spot on his porch, watching it all with satisfaction. He'd seen his share of battles, both in war and at home. Sometimes, he said to anyone who would listen, it takes a storm to clear the air. Inside their home, the soldier's family gathered around the dinner table, processing the day's events. The phone kept ringing with interview requests and messages of support. But what touched them most were the small gestures, the neighbor kids asking to see the soldier's medals, the quiet apologies, the genuine attempts to understand. "You know what's funny?" the soldier said to his parents. "In the service, we learned that the strongest unit is often the one that's been through the toughest fights together." He looked out the window at their changing neighborhood. Maybe that's true for communities too. His mother reached for his hand, her eyes full of pride, not just for his medals and service, but for the way he had helped transform conflict into connection. Outside, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of hope, as neighbors who had been strangers yesterday waved to each other across their lawns, united by a new understanding of what it truly means to be a community. 3 months after the homecoming celebration that changed everything, the neighborhood had become a different place. The transformation wasn't just in the obvious things, like the new flags flying from front porches or the regular visits between neighbors who once avoided each other. It was in the small moments, the daily interactions that showed how deeply things had shifted. The soldier's mother stood in her kitchen, preparing for the first meeting of the Neighborhood Diversity Committee, an idea that had grown from casual conversations over backyard fences into a real force for change. The woman from number 42 would be there, now one of the most active members. Her journey from that clipboard-wielding confrontation to genuine advocacy had inspired others to examine their own prejudices. Need help with those snacks? The soldier appeared in the doorway, home from his new job at the Veterans Center downtown. He turned down more prestigious offers to stay close to home, feeling called to help other veterans transition back to civilian life. His story had become a powerful tool in breaking down barriers. "You know what someone told me today?" he said, helping his mom arrange cookies on a plate. A family was thinking of moving into the neighborhood. They drove by, saw all the different folks out walking their dogs together, kids playing basketball in mixed groups. They said it felt like what America is supposed to be. Outside, the evening was alive with the sounds of community. The elderly veteran neighbor had started a weekly gathering on his porch where he shared war stories with local teenagers. Not the glorified kind, but honest talks about service, sacrifice, and coming home to a country that didn't always understand. The HOA had undergone its own revolution. The old rules about maintaining neighborhood character were being rewritten to focus on genuine community building. The president, who had once worried about property values, now proudly pointed to their diversity as their greatest asset. "Remember that first weekend?" the soldier's father asked, joining them in the kitchen. "Who would have thought one party could change so much?" He glanced at the family calendar on the fridge, now packed with community events, barbecues, veterans support meetings, cultural exchange dinners. The local kids have learned their own lessons. The basketball hoop in the soldier's driveway had become neutral territory where kids from all backgrounds came to play. They'd even started a weekend league, with the soldier and his unit buddies as coaches. The woman from number 42 arrived early for the committee meeting, carrying a folder of ideas instead of complaints. Her transformation had been the most profound. "You know what my daughter said?" she shared as she helped set up chairs. "She said she's proud to come home now, proud of how we've changed." The soldier's mother smiled, remembering their first tense encounters. "Change isn't always easy," she said, "but it's always possible." More neighbors began arriving for the meeting. The local news station was there too, doing a follow-up story on how one viral video had sparked lasting change in a community. But the real story wasn't in the headlines or social media posts. It was in the way people now looked each other in the eye, asked about each other's families, celebrated each other's joys, and supported each other through hard times. The soldiers' unit members still visited regularly, now welcomed as part of the extended neighborhood family. They'd brought their own families, shared meals, and helped build the understanding that military service transcends all boundaries. "You know what's funny?" the soldier said, watching the meeting room fill up. "In combat, we learned that survival depends on looking out for each other. Turns out that's true here at home too." His mother squeezed his hand, proud not just of his military service, but of how he'd helped transform their community. The diversity committee meeting began, but it felt more like a family gathering than a formal event. People shared stories, plans, and dreams for their neighborhood's future. Later that night, as the last neighbors headed home, the soldier stood on his front porch. The street was quiet now, but a different kind of quiet than before. Not the silence of separation and suspicion, but the peace of a community at rest. His father joined him, both men looking out at the neighborhood they now truly called home. "You fought for this," the father said softly, "not just over there, but right here." The soldier nodded, understanding that some battles are won with courage and bullets, while others are won with patience and open hearts. The neighborhood had become a testament to both kinds of victory. Inside, his mother was already planning the next community event. The calendar was full, but not with complaints and confrontations. Instead, it was filled with potlucks and prayer circles, veteran support meetings, and youth mentoring programs. The next generation was growing up seeing what was possible when people chose understanding over fear. "This," the soldier thought, watching porch lights wink out one by one, "this is what we fought for." Not just the freedom to live where you choose, but the wisdom to live together in peace. The neighborhood had become more than just a collection of houses. It was now a living example of what community could be.